now, back to Secrets of the Viking Warriors on National Geographic. In the 9th century AD, the Vikings rapidly extended their sphere of influence across the globe from Asia to the fringes of North America. But within 2 centuries, the Vikings would find themselves consigned to the back pages of history, their unique achievement blunted by the very success they had craved. How could they rise so fast, yet fade so quickly? What secrets lie behind Viking Decline? It looks like something from another world. In the flat Danish countryside, a gigantic circular feature. From the air, its geometry is eerily perfect. But this is no alien crop circle. In fact, it's a Viking fortress. Its name, Trelleborg. Trelleborg comes late in the Viking story. It dates from the end of the 10th century, and it reveals just how far the Vikings had strayed from their origins. Over 200 years earlier, the Vikings had burst onto the scene as sea-borne raiders. During the first half of the 9th century AD, they had looted churches and monasteries in Western Europe, a tactic made possible by one thing: their ships. The fortress at Trelleborg was not the work of the sea-borne warriors who had rocked the foundations of Western Europe. This was a structure built by people with money and power, who had something to protect. As such, Trelleborg marks a process of rapid social and political change in the Viking world, a process that was eventually to lead to the end of the Viking Age. The story of Viking decline begins, ironically, with one of their greatest successes, the near conquest of a country, England. In 865, a giant invasion fleet carrying thousands of men suddenly appeared off the English coast. Viking raiders were about to become invaders.
Where previously there'd just been a few ships at sea, now there was a great fleet, hundreds of vessels arriving, carrying thousands of men. As a result, in the 860s and 70s, many of the English kingdoms fell to the Vikings.
It came to be called the Great Army. At first, the English thought it was just another coastal raiding party. But this time, the Vikings didn't leave. They headed inland. The aim was no longer raiding, but conquest.
They moved on to stealing the land itself. And this, of course, is colonization. This is the conquest of territories and their occupation.
Why the Vikings had chosen this moment to change their strategy remains a mystery. But maybe the prospect of England's green and pleasant land had simply become irresistible.
It must have seemed like heaven. Rich farmlands, silver in plenty, plenty to plunder, and then a realization that you could actually take the place over, that it was potentially right for the picking. If you had the warrior power, perhaps you could carve out new lands for yourself.
At first, the Vikings swept all before them. They overran East Anglia, Mercia, and Northumbria. As historian Sarah Foote has found, contemporary accounts describe the Vikings' terrifying and bloody trail of destruction.
We have some accounts from the early period of the bloodshed, the terror, the devastation.
The Vikings showed no mercy, even to royalty, as the fate of the unfortunate Edmund of East Anglia reveals.
Without ceasing, he called on Christ. This aroused the fury of his enemies, who, as if practicing at a target, pierced his whole body with arrows and inflicting wound upon wound while one javelin made room for another.
It's no wonder the Vikings swiftly terrorized the English into submission. Within a few years of their first landing, Viking advances covered nearly 50% of English territory, leaving only the southern kingdom of Wessex standing firm. But conquering a country was a very different proposition to coastal raiding. The Vikings found themselves fighting a land-based campaign against Anglo-Saxon royal armies. So how did they do it? The key to their success lies with a remarkable tactic. Avoiding pitched battles, the Vikings instead preferred to sally forth from hastily constructed fortified camps. In effect, they adapted the seaborne hit-and-run tactics for which they were famous and transferred them to the land.
It was more a war of maneuver and the taking of fortifications, and that is the real danger for the English kingdom.
The Vikings' campaign climaxed with the final capture of this place. The Vikings called it Jorvik. We know it today as the English city of York.
They marched up here. They managed to win a battle to capture the city. The Anglo-Saxon kings of Northumbria regrouped, tried to counterattack the next year, were defeated. And that really left the great Viking army in control of York.
With the taking of York, the Vikings' transition from coastal raiders to inland invaders was complete. But as they settled down in York, the Vikings were to undergo a further evolution, a process of change that would ultimately cause a crucial split in the Viking world. Archaeologist Richard Hall is taking a trip back through time. For him, the Viking city of Jorvik lies all around him, just beneath the surface of modern York.
The very street we're walking down, Coppergate, was laid out in the Viking Age, and even the properties, even the land divisions between the shops opposite were established for the first time in the Viking Age. So we're really walking around a bit of Viking Age townscape. It's a new creation.
Before the Viking conquest, York was little more than a backwater with a sparse population. But with the victory over the Anglo-Saxons, the Vikings saw an opportunity to rebuild the local economy in a completely new way.
The Vikings came along, took this place over, and within 30 to 50 years, they'd pretty well transformed it.
Spurred on by the new Viking regime, York rapidly became a sprawling city.
These streets that we're walking along were huddled close with little shops and properties. It was a low-rise townscape. It was a place where you only had really one story. They were timber buildings, roofed with thatch, and there were no decent paved roads like we see today. The roads were just basically rubble and muck. All of this had a population perhaps of 10, 15, even 20,000 people. So it was an extraordinary place.
Founding a city like this hardly seems to square with the image of Vikings as warriors. So how did it come about? Next, from killing to commerce. What was the catalyst for this Viking transformation? Digs turn up dozens of clues. Secrets of the Viking warriors is back only on the National Geographic Channel. And now, back to Secrets of the Viking Warriors on the National Geographic Channel. Artifacts recovered by York archaeologists provide important clues. Over the past 20 years, excavations in the city center have yielded more than 20,000 Viking Age objects. Together, these objects demonstrate that one-time raiders and conquerors had begun to pursue a completely different and unwarlike activity, manufacture. And that's why York grew so big so fast.
We found dozens of these wooden bowls and wooden cups. This was the common tableware of the period. And obviously they were doing this on an industrial scale. This was one of the innovations of the Viking Age in York, that for the first time there was industrial scale production going on.
And the manufacture didn't stop with woodworking. As the Viking market economy grew, metalworkers turned out tons of cheap fashion jewelry.
They were churning the stuff out, mass producing it, in such a way as to make it available just to the man and woman in the street, in a way that hadn't been before.
Leather workers produced mountains of shoes, many with fascinating design features that reveal just how much the people of Jorvik geared themselves to mass production.
The whole sole was detachable, and when you wore through that, you simply ripped it off, threw it away, and the cobbler put a new one on for you.
And incredibly, among the piles of discarded soles, archaeologists found this, an accessory straight out of modern times, a detachable ice skate. Such artifacts reveal that York was an economic first.
It's the role of York as a supplier of local goods which really sets York up and marks it out as a place that's expanding and growing and taking on this new role as a major production centre.
Crucial to York's economic success was the way the Vikings mixed with the local Anglo-Saxons. As the English and Norse emblems on this coin die reveal, to make York a success, the Vikings willingly embraced English culture, including the religion the Vikings once reviled, Christianity.
It's got an inscription in abbreviated Latin that says St. Peter's money. St. Peter is the dedication of the cathedral church, so it's a good Christian inscription. And yet in between it, what have we got? It's a Viking sword. Almost symbolises the coming together of these two peoples, the Anglo-Saxons and the Vikings.